Welcome. This is That Shakespeare Life, the place where we explore what it was like to live in turn of the 17th century England, the way Shakespeare would have lived it. This week, we're exploring plants and specifically the tubers of the 17th century by asking, did Shakespeare eat sweet potatoes? It seems like a simple question, but it turns out that the potato had a pretty complicated history for Shakespeare's lifetime. Before Europeans encountered the Americas, the world didn't have the global food associations that we think of today because new foods were being brought back and forth across the Atlantic. And as Europeans were introduced to new foods for the first time, they had to invent new words, new meanings, and sometimes they used the same word for different plants. That was certainly what happened to the potato. In the 1500s and early 1600s, potato wasn't specific to the yellow or white tuber we know it as now. The word could refer to white potatoes, of course, or even yellow potatoes that you're probably used to eating, but they could also mean any number of Native American tubers, like the aca or the mashua, which were native to the Americas at this time, but they're totally unknown to us now. And of course, as you might be anticipating, the word potato could also mean sweet potatoes, the orange fleshed tuber that's popular at holidays like Thanksgiving here in the US. Of course, to sort all of this out and to learn more about how Shakespeare's world understood the potato, I spoke with food historian Rebecca Earle. Here's what she had to say.
Well, I guess the first thing to say is what is a potato? So, Europeans encountered all kinds of unfamiliar foodstuffs when they traveled to the Americas from 1492 and thereafter. I mean, all sorts of foods that are now absolutely central to how people all around the world eat. And potatoes are one of them, but we might also think of tomatoes. I mean, there was no pasta with tomato sauce in Italy before colonization of the Americas. There were no spicy chili peppers in the Indian subcontinent before this. There was no maize. There was no polenta in the region around Venice. There was no chocolate in Switzerland. I mean, lots and lots of foods that we associate with quite different parts of the world are actually native to the Americas and were part of what's sometimes referred to as the Columbian exchange, which is a sort of funny word having to do with Christopher Columbus and a sort of idea that foods from Europe, like wheat or olive oil, so, no flour tortillas in Mexico before this, that foods from Europe and from Eurasia came to the Americas with Europeans, and foods from the Americas traveled all over the world. That's what people sometimes describe, as I said, in the slightly peculiar term, the Columbian exchange. And among the foods that Europeans and also people from West Africa who participated, some as conquistadors, in these European and West African invasions of the Americas, some of the foods that they encountered for the first time were root vegetables, were tubers. So they encountered potatoes, they encountered sweet potatoes, they encountered cassava or manioc, as it's sometimes called. They encountered all kinds of different root vegetables or, roots and tubers of one sort or another. And Europeans tended to clump these things together into the category of roots. Botanists will tell us that sweet potatoes are botanically totally different from potatoes, and that both of those are botanically different yet again from Jerusalem artichokes. Have you encountered Jerusalem artichokes?
Only briefly. They're here, but me personally, I haven't really.
Yeah, sometimes you could, I mean, sometimes you get Jerusalem artichoke chip, little sort of chips and that kind of thing. So they're also another tuber famous for provoking horrendous quantities of gas, which people even at the time joked about. And they're also botanically quite different. But Europeans often and in lots of different Western European languages referred to all of these things as roots or tubers or sort of knobbly things of one sort or another, and didn't see these as fundamentally different. And that's why we call sweet potatoes potatoes, right? That Europeans thought of them as a kind of potato. And, as I said, the botanists can say, no, 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 no. But from the point of view of the consumer, actually, I mean, they're not so different, right?
Well, certainly visually, they have the same general shape.
Yeah. And you might eat
And
them
they
in the
do
same
come out of
way.
the ground and you bake them the same way. So, yes.
Yeah. Yeah, and I mean cassava also is something that comes out of the ground. It's a big root. So the f very earliest potatoes, if we can call them that, that reached Europe were actually sweet potatoes. They're typical of the Caribbean. And they which is where Europeans got to first, their first landing sites were in the Caribbean. So they encountered those the very first. And so the very first potatoes that reached Europe were actually sweet potatoes. And those started getting grown actually in Spain, in the area around Malaga, pretty early. And they reached Europe quite early. It's a little hard to disentangle this because they're often called potatoes. And so the same word is used to talk about these different kinds of things. In England, when people at the time wanted to differentiate between sweet potatoes and potatoes, they might refer to sweet potatoes as Spanish potatoes.
So while Shakespeare never used the phrase Spanish potatoes, that is how sweet potatoes would have been described in his lifetime. And when Shakespeare mentions potatoes in his plays, like that famous joke from Falstaff when the sky rains potatoes in The Merry Wives of Windsor, we can't say for sure which tuber Shakespeare actually meant there. What we can say is that to his audience, the word potato suggested something exotic, something newly arrived from the Americas, and it was a food that was unusual and worth joking about. If you'd like to hear more about the history of potatoes in England, including how they were grown, the folklore surrounding them, and what Shakespeare's references might tell us about the 16th century, you can listen to our full conversation with Rebecca Earl on the podcast at CassidyCash.com/episode 388. And if you want to see visual history related to these potatoes, including woodcuts, botanical illustrations, and period paintings, then join us inside that Shakespeare Society for the insider's look at the history behind the conversation. You can find links to that Shakespeare Society on the podcast page. Again, that link is CassidyCash.com/episode 388. Thank you for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.